this a lovely image of them dancing, which once again, just look at this image, not the wider context. So going from this, that's mutual desire to get out. Get Out, a 2017 film written and directed by Jordan Peele, a Black male predominantly and known in the industry for his comedy, but now preeminent horror director. So here we're going to be talking about one of my favorite quotes. My parents aren't racist, red flags of contemporary race relations. Weaponizing white femininity, which we've sort of already touched on when we talked about Bridgerton. It's not necessarily weaponized in Candyman, but we will see it mirrored here, as Sam sort of touched on it. And then the relationships as a locus of horror, not just a relationship in Get Out, but ultimately we'll be talking about all three. So the synopsis of Get Out is very basic. It's a young Black man who decides to go meet his white girlfriend's parents and spend the weekend with them. They've been dating for 5 months. They're becoming a little bit more serious. So he agrees to go. Obviously that is not how it goes. And there's a whole nother motivation for her to take him there. This is them in the car. Look how happy they are as they're driving up there. So last time I went and I did red flags about the film first, but I think it might help to have some context as to what happens after this. And so we're gonna watch a little clip about the coagula, which, no, still not playing. Okay, give me a second. I will switch screens.
Remember to share sound.
Yes, okay. There we go. Oh, share sound.
Is there anything more beautiful than a sunrise?
All right, so if you haven't seen Get Out, that gives you an idea of what it's about. So the previous image that I showed you was them going up to the family, and this is why she was taking him up there. I ended that scene on the deer for a specific reason. So when this is when they first show up at her parents' house. And now I'm just going to go through a few red flags of the film. And when Sam and I were watching this together, some of our red flags were different, but some of them actually weren't. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But so the focus on the deer. This is something that her father says when he is first meeting him. I say one down, a couple 100,000 to go. I don't mean to get on my high horse, but I'm telling you, I do not like the deer. I'm sick of it. Apologies for the typo. They're taking over. They're like rats. They're destroying the ecosystem. I see a dead deer on the side of the road, and I think that's a start. The reason why the camera stops on the deer is because in this exchange, the father is not actually talking about deer, rather he's talking about Black people. And that's a visual key for you to reference back to the scene and be like, oh, no, okay. Then the next slide, which is another red flag, is the father once again saying, so how long has this been going on, this thing? And he points between them and says it the same way I do. And it's him speaking. And this is where Sam and I started talking about the different levels of racism and the performative aspects of them. So the father, as you can see from these quotes, is at level 1 racism. There's 3 that we identified in this film. So level 1 racism is both of the parents, but the father is much more overt about it. And they read as racists who are trying to perform anti-racism. They're the people who say, I don't see color. But when they meet somebody who is of a specific minority group, they try to connect by doing things like using slang or asking them about stereotypes that are associated with that ethnic group. So later, when they're having dinner, the father asks Chris, who is the young Black man, Rose, the daughter, Evil, whether or not he enjoys basketball, which is a common stereotype that's associated with Black men, but also just Black culture. This is also another indication of level 1 performative racism. The father tells Chris, I would have voted for Obama for a 3rd term if I could. Now, this is one of my favorite quotes because this is something that I personally heard a lot throughout Obama's years, partially because I was living in DC at the time, and then also because I was working in the news. And people love to say this as proof that they were not racist, but the truth is it's trying to claim support as Obama as proof of your racism rather than actually as proof of your lack of racism, rather than actually doing the work to destroy institutionalized racism that continues to exist and pervade, at least in America, every aspect of American life. But you would have voted for Obama for a 3rd time. So getting to Rose, we're going to talk about level 2 racism. So Rose is ultimately the villain here, but when she is luring Chris in, when she's saying that she loves him during this entire 5-month period, she is performing level 2 racism. So she's performing not being a racist, and she wants to make her non-racist persona clear, but she hasn't fully examined her own biases and tendencies. And so while she's not overperforming in the way that her parents are doing, trying to quote unquote connect with BIPOC through slang and through cultural stereotypes, she's still not fully examining the institutionalized racism that she benefits from. Now, obviously, Rose knows what she's doing, but this is the racism that she is playing. And so the idea of her not fully examining her biases and tendencies comes through in this conversation with Chris. So this is before they drive up to her parents and they're in the car, and he asks directly, like, have you told your parents that I'm Black? And she makes a joke of it, like, oh, I mean, why would I need to? Why would I need to tell them? Like, my parents aren't racist. What am I going to say? I'm bringing my boyfriend, who's Black, a Black man, up to visit a Black. And then Chris's response is, so I was the first Black guy you ever dated. And she goes, yeah, so what? So her inability in this exchange to recognize that she has biases and tendencies, but also that she benefits to the extent that she doesn't actually have to think about race and have that conversation, play as a red flag. This is also another red flag, because this is the moment where she just realized that her parents are racist. It's following those previous quotes where they were sitting in the living room, and she's telling Chris how she's so surprised, she had no idea. This is supposed to be a symbol. This is supposed to sort of show us that no, she's not, as Sam and I have identified it, level 2 racist, that she actually does think about her biases and tendencies, that she does examine her own privilege. And the entire exchange between them is supposed to show that, because she calls out her parents and was like, oh my God, I can't believe it. But similar to the previous slide that I showed where she's on the bed, it ends with her ultimately seducing him, kissing him, and then them having sex. So every time Chris starts to question it, she initiates sexual intercourse. I guess I could just say sex. And so the conversation stops. And this is where we start to see the pattern of her weaponizing her white femininity. Now, this is the level 3 racism that we identified. This man is one of the people who was actually at the auction trying to buy Chris's body. Chris is a photographer, a semi-professional photographer, and he's trying to break into more of being in like art galleries and things of that nature. And this man owns an art gallery. And so after Chris meets all of the other people who are basically bidding on them, he's very aware of the fact that he is one of 2 Black people who are there, and he's uncomfortable. So he goes down by the gazebo just to get away from them, and he runs into this man. And when Chris walks up, he says, "Ignorance. They mean well, but they have no idea what real people go through." Basically trying to show that he understands Chris in a better way, that he doesn't view him just as this Black man dating this young white woman. And this is what we call level 3 racism. Because this character, Jim Hudson, doesn't think he's racist because he isn't like the others. He can see how the type of racism and that the parents are performing, he can see the type of racism that Rose is performing. And because he recognizes those performances, he's like, I am not like them. But in doing so, he also assumes that he isn't performing those same acts of racism, just doing it in a different way. And he fails to see how he's perpetuating and engaging in the very same racism and dehumanization that they're actively performing, that they're against, because he's also complicit in the human action. Because what happens is that Jim Hudson actually is the one who wins the lotto for Chris's body. So the clip about the coagula procedure, that Chris is tied down in the chair. He's tied down in the chair because Jim Hudson is being prepped to take his body. So the next red flag, and this is where we were talking about how it compares to Bridgerton, and what Sam mentioned earlier is the use of gaslighting, ultimately to turn the victim into the one who's doing wrong. So after all of this happens, Chris is he's feeling very uncomfortable. He's the only Black person there. Her parents are obviously racist. Her brother's racist and tried to fight with him. Has the idea that Black men are more physical, and so like he wants to fight him to see if he can beat him. And Chris is like, I just need to go. And Rose, as you can see in the screenshot, starts crying and turns away from him and sits on a bench by the water and says, "You want to go without me?" Immediately, the fact that he is feeling threatened is no longer important. It's about her being left alone, which it's her family. She should be fine. But he loves her, he listens to her, and she's a white woman crying, and therefore they don't leave. Which of course results in the next slide, which is Chris sinking into the sunken place. Rose's mom is a hypnotist, and she has the ability to hypnotize somebody and causes them to become smaller in their own mind, losing physical control of their body. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. As Chris sinks down in his own brain into the sunken place, and Rose leans over him and says, "You were one of my favorites." After Chris is taken to the lab for the coagula procedure, Rose quickly decides to get her life back in order the way it was prior to beginning this 5-month seduction of Chris. And she's sitting on her bed, and people have commented before about the scene where you can only see the top of the bowl, but she's eating Fruit Loops separately and then drinking the milk separately. But what's really telling to me is that all of the pictures that are on the back wall, previously they had been taken down, but each of them is actually a picture of a different victim. And it goes approximately 5 across, and I believe it's 4 or 5 up. And these are her trophies, similar to how the deer was on, the head of the deer was on the wall in the coagula lab where Chris was. You see her similarly over her bed in her bedroom with her trophies hung on the wall behind her. in the end, she once again tries to weaponize her white femininity and white tears. Chris is able to escape from the chair using cotton, which is why it's the background of this slideshow. He uses cotton picked from the chairs and puts it in his ears. It's a symbol because cotton was something that was one of the major reasons why that slavery was so profitable in the US, cotton and tobacco. So he picks the cotton and puts it in his ears to stop himself from being hypnotized again. And he's able to kill her entire family, which is one of the few times I will ever say that sentence and be cheering inside when I say it. And as he's escaping, Rose shoots the car. He has to get out of the car, and then they end up, he doesn't shoot her. One of the other victims shoots Rose, but she's still alive, and Chris is like, I have to take care of this because she'll come after me, which she would. And so he goes and he's leaning over her, and she says, Chris, it's me. I'm so sorry. I love you. I love you. And in saying it's me, she's implying that just as he was hypnotized by her mother to lose control over his body, the same thing was done to her. So making herself not the person who literally just had a double-barrel shotgun shooting at his car, but now again the white female victim who was crying and should be forgiven. And of course, this time though, Chris doesn't fall for it because this film has a happy ending, and he starts to strangle her, and proving that what she was saying was simply just an emotional manipulation and that her tears were fake and that she was actively weaponizing his love for her. Because once again, 5-month relationship, he thinks it's serious. He thinks she loves him and he loves her. She smiles when he starts to strangle her. And this smile can be interpreted a lot of different ways, but I interpret it as her being pleased that she still had such an effect on him and that he still cared enough that he had to kill her, even though he knows that she doesn't really care for him, but she's still getting the last word because she's made him into a murderer. And then I should have included a slide of his friend Rob, who shows up in a police car, because it's the moment that everybody in the theater always cheers. But I wanted to end it with the idea of white femininity being weaponized. So it's this disturbing picture is what I'm going to end on.
Yay. Lots of yes, I think just to be clear, because I'm not sure if you said it or not, when we were talking about the sort of 3 levels of racism, we were talking about sort of white liberal racism.
Yes, apologies.
Performative aspect. There's a sort of performative anti-racism that is part of that racism, if that makes sense.
Right.
And our levels were not from best to worst. It was from most to least obvious, perhaps, I think is the best way to describe it. I'm not sure if you agree.
Yeah, I guess so. Like, yeah.
Something like that. It's not like, oh, it's great to be like the dad. Very much not. Especially trafficking in human bodies.
Yes.
Yeah. So was there anything that you wanted to discuss or ask Tanagra before we wrap our discussion?
I mean, I feel like I don't really have as much to say about Get Out because it actively interacts with the history and the culture that it is written in. So there's also something to be said about the fact that Jordan Peele, who's a Black man, did write it for a Black audience. So when I'm watching this, a lot of common feedback that I heard from other people before I watched it was that a lot of Black audiences, and this is not just Black American audiences, but Black British, Black from other places, Daniel Kula, who plays Chris, himself is Black British, was that for Black people, this is actually more of a comedy than anything, because there's so many moments of recognition of when he's uncomfortable, of when he recognizes that he's not safe. So the horror doesn't come from the interactions, it's more the horror comes from when is he going to face up to the fact that his girlfriend that he loves is racist. And so you're sitting there waiting for him to have that realization moment. And I think that in speaking to other people who are non-Black who watch this, the horror moments hit a little bit differently, particularly for a lot of white Americans. It's recognition that some of the things that Rose or her parents or Jim Hudson, who ends up buying Chris, say are things that they have said themselves, especially around that Obama conversation. And there's a level of discomfort with possibly seeing yourself in characters that are inexplicitly evil. Yeah, and I think it's a very interesting watch experience. And I also don't think this is a romance, just putting that out there before we start that conversation. But I do see the comparisons between Bridgerton, that is supposed to be a romance, and that is sold as such. Propaganda, it's powerful.
Yeah. I mean, we sort of watched it together, and reactions are different. I had definitely had a moment of like, oh, I've definitely said something that performed like that. Not performed to suggest that there's a necessary falsity to what you're doing, but in terms of you are deliberately creating a sort of external manifestation of a particular sort of persona. I think, if that makes sense to people. So things that she said, like sort of one of the things that Tanagra and I talked about today was where she very sort of performatively draws out the racist actions of her parents. And I think that there is a tendency for white people like myself to show that we're not racist by being like, look, I saw it. I got that was racist. And then telling Black people about it who are like, yes, I also already realized that. Thank you very much for telling me. I do not need to have any extra racism in my day.
Yeah, the performative element is something that also you see Chris doing as a Black person who is in a predominantly white area. And that's where a lot of the humor for the Black audience comes in, though, because you recognize that aspect of it. And you're just like, oh yeah, I do that. Oh, I do that too. Oh my gosh, he really captured this very specific thing that I do when I'm in these situations and I can't get away from them. Like, that's where a lot of the humor will come in. But there's also a warning in the fact that it takes him so long. It is literally not until Rose is like, yeah, no, I'm not gonna give you these keys so you can get away, that he's like, oh, she's evil too. Even though he found the pictures of all of her exes beforehand, he's still like, no, okay, maybe not. Like, he's doubting, but he's not trusting that. So even to the Black audience, it's a warning. Like, nobody is safe from judgment and commentary in this film. And I think but what the judgment and commentary differs depending on who you are and what your background is, and also how you identify. That's one reason why I love this film and watch it a lot. So I think it's also important to note that I mentioned that Jordan Peele is interacting with the history. The fact that Daniel Kaluuya is darker skinned, and then in the opening of the film, he's getting ready for the day, but you can see that he's very fit, he's very healthy, and he's playing with that idea of the Black brute, the Black male, as being more, more athletic, stronger, and better at physical activities. Like, that's the strength. But he's engaging with it. He's not presenting him as an object to be stared at. He's presenting him as this stereotype or this archetype, and rather, where do you take that when you're trying to remove somebody from that history? And it's ultimately that, he kills everybody, so it speaks for itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sort of to summarize, I guess, what we were trying to do today, we picked the 3 texts that we picked because we thought that they all mixed love and horror in different ways. And there's also kind of a reflection of a number of sort of similar themes. We're seeing these interracial relationships. We're seeing these kind of relationships as a locus of horror. We're also seeing, these ideas about the Black male body and objectification. We're seeing these power dynamics, etc. So we were picking up on a lot of through threads, and hopefully as we've been going through, you've seen the ways in which we've been connecting Bridgerton and Get Out, for example, or Candyman and Get Out, or Candyman and Bridgerton, and how we're picking up on these threads. So my last question to you, Tanagra, and then it's a question to the audience as well, is of these three films, how would you rank them in order of romance, and how would you rank them in order of horror?
Most romantic is Candyman. That's it. The other, that's it. It's just Candyman. In order of horror, the most horrific, well, the least horrific, I would say, is not Bridgerton, excuse me, is probably Get Out. If nothing else, also because the ending of the film suggests that with his friend showing up and having killed the two doctors who are able to perform this coagula process, that the process can't happen anymore. And so for me, that's the least horrific. After that, I'd probably say Candyman, because jump scares and supernatural beings who can kill me through a mirror just sound creepy. And then the most horrific is Bridgerton, because it's portraying what is obviously an unhealthy, abusive relationship as romantic. And I have a lot of issues with that. Yeah, and that it doesn't, like, not only does it portray an unhealthy relationship as romantic and acceptable and something that the victim of the relationship should work for, but then it also doesn't interact with the history that it creates for itself. And in not doing so becomes a racist and abusive text. That's just mind-boggling that nobody saw it. So yay for Candyman, and Bridgerton is the true horror. That's my summary, yes.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think like we did them in order in a sense for horrifying. And I think that Get Out is the least horrifying because it recognizes its terms and interacts and really cleverly and well portrays the kind of social, political and kind of power dynamics which it is critiquing. So it's very aware. I think Candyman is sort of partly aware, as we talked about. It's trying to kind of engage with these ideas of race, but it performs these ideas of the white savior, for example. It makes the black victim monstrous. But Bridgerton, for me, watching that scene, and I think more the discourse around it, where I see people celebrating that scene and celebrating that depiction, is horrifying to me. And like watching that scene, of all the scenes that we watched, like in full disclosure, in Get Out, the scene where he loses control of himself for the first time, I didn't like that at all, because that is like a triggery thing for me, that kind of loss of control and identity and that withdrawal. But in terms of more broadly, the most horrifying scene that we watched tonight was the scene that we showed from Bridgerton, I think, because it's so insidious, because it's telling you that is, you're meant to view it the way Daphne does.
Yes, and meant to view it like that for several episodes, like until the end of the entire first season. You're meant to see Daphne as the one who is suffering and not Simon. It's this, once again, and not interacting with the history, it's almost dehumanizing him. Yeah.
I mean, it's a weird one, Wes. I you know, it's sparkly and it's nice, and you know, some of the critique of it is misplaced. So some of the critique that talks about like historical accuracy, the sleeves are wrong. I don't really have a great deal of time for that as a critique of it. I think that you can update shows, make them modern, play with things if you want to, as long as there's a sort of understanding of what you're playing with. But you know, those critiques and I'm not particularly valid or exciting. I mean, you know, if people don't want to watch it because of that, that's fine. But I don't think we should sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater and throw out these other critiques, you know. And there's also the problem with Bridgerton is that there are racist critiques of Bridgerton that are sort of like, well, there wouldn't have been black people, would there? Which is partly, you know, the beginning of the talk. Yes, there would. There was a diverse society of the period which we can interact with. So, you know, we don't want to fall into that kind of, you know, you don't want to be associated with that kind of critique, but there is a lot of critique to be done with it. And I think, like, I mean, this isn't related to race, but for me, the thing with the babies, I don't understand how that is still a feature of romance. Like, if people's happy ever after involves a child, that's totally fine, obviously. But what the narrative does is produce this kind of the idea of the inadequacy, and almost like she talks about it as torture, you know, that she has had to give up her life to be with him because he can't have children,
Right.
you know, which is horrendous. Like, yeah, it was awful. It was awful to watch that being all the way through, and then at the end celebrated because she gets pregnant, and that's meant to be a happy ending. Like, what are we talking about? What? No.
9 months later, his lifetime of like emotional abuse by his father, and that to the extent he didn't want children, is magically healed because she loves him.
Yes, and it's particularly healed by the fact that she read his private correspondence relating to his traumatic childhood. Now that's the way you build trust.
I mean, how else do you do it in a relationship, Sam? How else? Yeah.
I don't know. I quite often go and sort of seek out people's letters, their texts or emails. Let me check what sadness has happened to you in the past. Oh, I get it. Yes.
Now I understand you, and I'll forgive you for being a victim. Yeah, no. I think another. No, blast. I lost my train of thought. I totally lost my train of thought right there, but I'll remember it.
Talking about the letters. The letters are horrendous. Okay. So, I mean, to you guys, over to you. Like, you don't have to agree with our readings, and if you've not seen the films, you know, I don't know who's seen what, but yeah, I guess sort of how do you understand these films? How do you kind of, which is the one that you think is most romantic, which is the one that you think is most horrifying, or more terrifying? I don't know. Just kind of over to you if you've seen them. Nobody. Oh,
Chris?
go for it. Yeah, sleep in. Yes, Chris.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right.
So I haven't seen either one of those three, and I'm probably not gonna watch Bridgerton now. My boyfriend actually watched it, and he was actually enjoying it. I don't know. So just based on what I've heard from you, and I think, yeah, the loss of agency is very terrifying in both Bridgerton and Get Out, I'd say, in different ways, obviously, because it's different situations. But like, as you said, Sam, like the loss of agency when he loses control and you're not like in control of yourself anymore, while at the same time still experiencing everything, is like very frightening. And then, but at the same time, Bridgerton and the loss of agency there, and also the toxic like perpetuation of heteronormativity in this barely legal in like current terms woman who is like weaponizing literally everything about herself, or who has been written to weaponize everything about her persona, is just very frightening on a different level as well. Yeah. And Candyman, I'm not sure, maybe it's maybe you have to see the entire thing in order to, because obviously it's like written as a slasher movie as well, right? Or it has elements of slasher in it, does it? A bit.
Sort of, yeah. There's a lot of flashing that goes on.
And it does feel a little more campy in a way. Maybe it's because it's from the 90s. I don't know. It's just yeah. I
think like Candyman's a really funny one because I was watching it again this week with Tanagra. When I watched the first part, I'm like, oh my God, this is so annoying. And then like as soon as Tony Todd appears and the kind of dynamics of their relationship kick in, it becomes a really interesting text. But I think there's quite a lot wrong with the depiction of academia. There's a lot of kind of either a little bit lazy or a little bit misguided interactions with the historical context and social context, which make it frustrating to watch. So it's not kind of like an anti-racist masterpiece, or, you know, but it's an enjoyable watch. Like I do enjoy it. I just have to get through the first like 40 minutes of ridiculousness, like just screaming every now and again, very weakly, the academia. No, that's not how it works.
That is what it was like watching it together.
Yeah. I was reining it in as well, because like I could say it every 5 seconds. It's incredibly frustrating because she's like, 3 years into my PhD, I think I'm going to start a new research project, and I'm doing folklore, but for some reason I'm going to go and photograph a murder victim's flat.
Yeah.
That's how research works, guys. That's what I do. I'm just like, wake up on a Tuesday and I'm like, yeah, I think I'm just gonna like take some pictures or something. I don't know, whatevs, off I go. Sorry, Tanagra, what were you thinking?
No, I was thinking about something that Christopher said, and I can't remember specifically what it is that you said, but it made me think of the potential queer baiting that they're going to have to address in season 2. I wish you said something that reminded me of that they sort of like touch on the possibility that one of the brothers is queer, and then he meets the artist who's married and has a beard, and he's gay and has a lover, a committed lover. And then there's sort of looks and filming that suggests that he might be too, but he just hasn't ever been given the freedom of space to explore that. But I've already been told that the books do not have any queer characters. So I'm also interested to see how that, all 8 are straight, okay. I'm also interested to see how that is played out and dealt with. I can't remember what you said that made me think of that also, but yeah.
Queer representation, yes. I mean, when we were watching it, it was like, oh, he's gay. He's going to be gay with the artist. And then it's like, nope, switch and like bait and change. He's now with a woman. And then he gets with the seamstress. And, you know, we're allowed there's a little sprinkle of gay for us. It's like, oh, look, I'm including a gay in my Regency world, but it's quite tragic. Don't worry, the gays are not happy here. You know, it feels quite a lot like that to me.
Yes, very, very much so. Yeah.
Every time Rish chimes in with Bridgerton facts, it's just like, no, it's worse than we thought.
The Marina story is interesting.
Oh, dear.
Jupiter, I think you were going to say something.
Yeah, I haven't seen Bridgerton, and it was kind of high on my list of like next to watch series, and you have bumped it a little bit down. So I think it's unlikely that I'm going to like prioritize it as much as I was wanting to. But about like, I found it interesting that Christopher, you thought that Candyman came across as campy, because I find like having seen Candyman and Get Out, one of the things that I didn't respond to very well in Get Out was precisely the tone that I find like a little too like comedic, precisely, and like at points, not the whole time. And like the parts that I responded to the most were precisely the parts that you showed today, of like when he's watching the video and when he's going into the dark place. Those moments, like I really enjoyed. And Candyman had like this atmosphere that I just really loved, and this like spookiness, and like I don't remember the name of the actor, but the actor who plays Candyman just like, he just does it so well. And like, it's like, I like, so in a way, I end up finding Candyman definitely creepier, and for that, I end up liking it a bit more than I like Get Out. So that's my input on that. I also wanted, like, I have kind of a question. I've heard that Jordan Peele wanted to, like, at first wanted to have an unhappy ending for Get Out. Mm-hmm. Have you heard about this? Like, and do you have like very strong opinions about this?
I think he went the right way. Sam and I have talked about this, and somebody this morning brought it up. knowing what the other ending was, I definitely think he went the right way. The entire film is so realistic, and once again, it's a film that's made for the Black public, and it came out after the murder of Trayvon Martin, so you don't need to see the police, right? The police showing up and arresting Chris, which was the original ending. Well, rather the alternative ending, because he made two because he wasn't certain. Is the little bit of reality that I don't need in that film. And so the fact that it's Rob and somebody talked about it, I read the comment, but like that's part of it adds that little touch of fantasy, but yet it works with the emotional roller coaster of the film. So yeah, I'm really happy that he went the other way. The people I watched it in the theater cheered. No matter what like race they were, like, ah, like they were so relieved, because like particularly in the American consciousness, like when you see a police car and a Black man, you're expecting like death, murder, you know, but this time it was like, it's a happy ending. He killed all those people and he's still gonna live. Like everybody felt that. So it was definitely the way to go. I hope he burnt the footage of the other ending.
I think like there's, you know, a lot of the discussion that's aroused recently because of Bridgerton, but not directly about it, is about like this idea, you know, either it has to be really heavy and engaging with the historical context and like dealing with the legacy of slavery, the slave trade, racism, or it can be happy and fantasy. And I think what the Get Out does really well is it doesn't refuse to engage with the context at all. It's based in it and it's working out of it, but it can still imagine a happy ending and it can still engage in that kind of fantasy motion as well. And I think for me, that was a really good choice. We don't need everything, you know, so many horror films end fantastically, as in it's a fantasy, it's fantastical, right? That, you know, against all odds, one person survives, and you have this kind of this tone of fantasy, this kind of upbeat, this catharsis that then ends with a sort of not with this existential depression and trauma. I think that, you know, if we're watching a Black horror movie for Black audiences, I think it makes sense that would be the case as well. Just as horror movies do more generally, engaging with sort of societal realities, but indulging in catharsis and a little bit of fantasy as well. I liked it. I feel like I was so glad when Rob turned up. I feel like
it's a happy moment.
I can't cope with him having done so much to escape, and it just wouldn't have mattered. Like,
yeah, that would have been way too much.
Mm-hmm. I also just kind of headcanoned Candyman as well. That like they're together in my head.
Okay, so
murderous spree.
That's how I wanted to interpret it the first time we watched it, because I was like, so when it's her funeral and they take the hook and they're dropping it into her coffin, then it's acting like a wedding band, so therefore they're together and they're killing. And I was like, all right, I was trying to push that narrative, and then it ends with that mural of just her, and I was like, okay, fine, it's a white savior trope. Like, I was trying, because I like the idea of them ending together, because it is a mutual desire. But then once again, the whole monstrosity of the victim of the Candyman comes up, and that he brings the child into the fire. But it also should be noted, Helen only saves that child because she sees the child's mom looking into the fire. It's not that she's like, oh, I should save the baby. It's she sees the mom looking into the fire, and then she's like, oh, okay, I guess I should fix what I've done. I know you might disagree, Stan.
No. I mean, a little bit, but no. I was just thinking it's a really interesting change from the original text, because the original text, the baby was already dead. And she goes to get it in order to take it to the police to dob everybody in for what they're doing. So it's when she crawls into the bonfire to get the baby that he's like, I knew you would come. Let's die together. And then they just die in the flames because the inhabitants of the location deliberately burn her to death.
Right.
So it's a really interesting flip. So like, you know, it seems to become even more deliberate that there's a live baby and he's trying to create his little family perhaps. And
yeah, I like that ending better. There's a few comments in that I wanted to.
Do you think Helen learned anything?
Yes, but also I thought, but Siam's earlier comment that if Simon had talked about racist actions, he wouldn't be believed, and I think that's an interesting comment. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think they almost remove the possibility of it though from the text, don't they?
Yeah.
By creating that weird flip, they remove racism from their world building, but not from the world that they've built, if that makes any sense to what I mean.
No, it completely does. Yeah, so I don't really know. I don't think it would ever come up. Also, I should hope it wouldn't, because obviously these writers don't know how to discuss race. So.
Yes. So does Helen learn anything, and does she ever acknowledge the horror? 100% no on that second one, I would say. I don't know what you think. Did she learn anything at all?
I think the clearest indication we get that she learned anything is that she saves the baby. I think that's the closest indication we get that she's trying to do something to rectify all of the horrors that she caused, because she does cause the murders of several people. And being like, oh, there's this serial killer, well, let me see what happens when I bring him around, is basically what she does. But when it comes to the baby, I think that's the only time you see her trying to do something that's good and to fix it. And even that, I think, is sort of motivated also by the fact that there's this a moment where she's talking with the child's mother and saying like, oh, I wanted a child, I don't have any yet. So even there's sort of a personal motivation to do so, not out of empathy necessarily.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe she doesn't learn anything at all.
I just feel like no, she doesn't learn anything. Because I think she learns that Trevor's a douchebag, I guess. That's a great learning curve for her. But I think like that's part of the problem, is that it focuses on this really poorly delineated feminism, but it doesn't interact with her whiteness at the same time.
No. I mean, yeah, which I guess the term intersectional feminism wasn't popular in '92, so maybe that's the excuse. But of course, now that the Candyman is having a spiritual, it's either reboot or spiritual sequel, but it's going to be written and directed by Jordan Peele. I have ridiculously high hopes for it. So yeah.
I don't know if anyone's going to be able to play the Candyman as well as Tony Todd did, though.
Maybe there will be no Candyman.
Chris? Tifa? Sorry.
I was like, I had one comment before when we left Bridgerton, before we moved on, and I wanted to quickly go back to that because I was interested in your take on that. So when you first introduced the screenshots to us of them in that moment, right, where in that moment where he's basically losing agency, and I hadn't seen anything of that episode, but the way the scene was shot and the characters were lit, and because of the fact that they were they are an interracial couple in an historical setting, I was like, okay, this is going to be followed by violence. There's going to be like, so to me, this had this feeling of foreboding, even like a little bit of dread, because I feel like we are in a way primed to like from the way we consume like I'm gonna use this loosely here, historical media, like movies about slavery, for example. Like if you ever have interracial couples or interracial relationships in a historical setting, it's usually like, at least from my perspective, in the context of slavery, right? In like huge Hollywood movies, it's rarely something outside of that context, and it's always preceded or followed by violence, or in a way it's embedded in a narrative of violence. And so my first gut reaction was cringing. It was like, oh my god, what's going to happen? Something bad is going to happen. And I feel like is that something like, I don't know, if like I was wondering if that's something conscious they're doing in the way they write these narratives, because like, yeah, it's just an impression I have, or like a feeling that there's a very negative way interracial relationships are depicted, at least in historical contexts. I can't think of any like positive ones out of the top of my head.
I mean, I can think of Belle, that Sam mentioned. There was a television show for a very short-lived period of time that dealt with the antebellum South, or it was early 1900s, like right after the Civil War, and there was an interracial relationship in it. It was one of the few historical dramas that has been produced in the US. But
Is colorblind, just floating.
No, that actually would have been interesting, but they actually dealt with race really well, and of course it got canceled after not even having a full season. Because so you talked about like slave narratives and Hollywood big pictures, and there's this fascination in Hollywood with Black suffering, and I think that you see that in a lot of slave narratives, which is why most of them are violent. Like, I'm not saying there are quote unquote happy slaves, but the fact that the violence in those stories, creatives choose to show it on screen, is definitely a choice. And so I can definitely understand why, when watching Bridgerton, especially with that lighting and with the power dynamic that is implied and how she is over him, that you would see, oh my gosh, violence might be next, because yeah, that is usually what happens. So I think that makes sense. But talking about white America's fascination with Black suffering through slave narratives is a whole different talk. So yeah. So no, good point.
I'm very wary of like critiquing Bridgerton and getting that as a response, that I'm asking for the depiction of Black suffering. But I am not.
Right.
I think, like, I mean, a lot of kind of how I'm influenced in sort of the way I think about and talk about this is through historical depictions that I have seen, and particularly romance, which includes Black characters and queer characters as well. I think this is the same thing, you know, like in terms of people saying you can't depict them unless it's suffering, and these tropes, right, kind of suffering. But there's work out there which does a great job of interacting with the history, but also is creating stories of joy and happy endings. And I think, yeah, that's what I would love to see from something like Bridgerton. But
I mean, I think that's what we went in expecting, right? It was just going to be happy, fluffy, people falling in love, shy hand holding. That's what I was looking towards. And instead it's racial issues, power dynamics, assault, perpetuation of negative stereotypes.
Kind of lazy on the history research. Sorry, Bridgerton. Just overall, like, you know, I don't want to be those 18th centuryists, but but I am, basically.
I mean, yeah. And now potential like queer baiting on top of everything else, which I know that storyline is going to disappoint. I already know. I feel it. I'm preparing myself for it. Like, or if they try to make like the next season diverse, it's gonna be the same issues. Like, I just don't see it getting better because this was such a hit. But I would love for it to.
I just love them to do somebody else's work. Really. I'd love them to do somebody else's work. I mean, hopefully the success of Bridgerton will lead to more interest in adapting period text like Regency romance and stuff. So that's kind of the hope that I would have, that if more interest, then we can kind of look at other writers, and we can look at queer romance from the period, and we can look at romance with people of color that's already been written by writers like Vanessa Riley, who put the research in, who put the history work in to do it well, you know?
Definitely. I mean, the talent is out there, but Julia Quinn was chosen.
Yeah. So. I think we should start like a campaign for our favorite books.
I will help.
Yeah. Very sad. I also like in terms of the filming of that scene, I find it quite inexplicable. I don't know. Like we were talking about this today, weren't we, Tanagra? Like, why did they make those filming choices?
Yeah.
I don't understand, because if you watch the whole scene, it goes from like sexy, sexy, sexy. And then you have like maybe a minute maximum where you realize that it's what's going on and what's gone wrong. And he's saying, wait, it's less than that. It's like 20, 30 seconds, which you pass by very quickly. And then you have this kind of emotional confrontation scene.
Right.
But kind of like watching it isolated, the horror of it is very, very clear, I think. But within the wider context, they haven't been trying to draw that out. It seems like it's surrounded, it's surrounded in a way that minimizes it, because it's making you focus on sexy, 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 and then you're not allowed to stop and be horrified at what happens in the sex scene, because you're being pushed into an emotional identification with Daphne.
Right.
So it's really weird to me, the filming, because all of those shots they're horror shots. Like whether you expect sort of violence or not, but like you said, that the shadow of the face, the look down, like the camera angle, it's a horror shot.
It really is, and even if you compare it to the rest of the show, like the rest of it is very bright, and like even when they're in the bedroom, it's a brighter scene, brighter lighting, but this one it's not. And Christopher sort of mentioned, like, did they mean to visually call back to these violent slave narratives? And honestly, Sam and I have talked about this, and we're just not really sure what they were going for in those directorial choices, because they just don't make sense for all the reasons that they said. Like, and then after that, though, it's her crying. So where emotionally, where are you supposed to be as a viewer? I mean, angry is an option.
Every time
I don't know what else you can know.
I can't really bear watching it anymore. I think that's probably my last time.
Completely.
Okay.
And thanks for clarifying, Jupiter, about Nia DaCosta. Yeah.
Definitely. Thank you. So thanks for coming, guys. Any more questions, feel free. I feel like it's been quite long today. I don't know. If you'd like to support us as we weekly finish, you can do so there. Thank you so much. Hopefully it was enjoyable. Hopefully it was just a wee bit over. So we went over it. We went over it. Great. Yeah, we did. Obviously the tiredness is setting in. But